Hi, Women of Welcome. I'm Sarah Casada, and today I am so excited because we are going to be talking with Jo Ann Van Engan. And for those of you who are new to the Women of Welcome community, I want to give you a brief introduction to who we are, and then I'll introduce her and we'll jump into our conversation. So for those of you new to Women of Welcome, we are a Christian community of women pursuing compassion and Christ-like welcome toward immigrants and refugees. You're invited to join us on Facebook or Instagram at Women of Welcome. And for those of you who are looking for a safe place where you can ask questions or talk with other women who are learning in this same space, we have a private Facebook group that's just for you, and it's also called Women of Welcome, and we encourage you to find us there and go deeper with our community. So today we are talking to Jo Ann, and she is the co-founder of the Association for a More Just Society and has lived in Honduras for 30 years. She has served as a professor and the co-director for the Honduran Justice Studies Semester Abroad program of Calvin College, along with her husband, Kurt. So this team, I love their mission for the work that they do. They say they strive to be brave Christians dedicated to doing justice in Honduras and to inspiring others around the world to seek justice in their own contexts. So I'm so excited to speak with her today, and I am going to flex my tech muscles here and bring her alongside to join us. Hi, Jo Ann. It's such a treat to have you here.
Hi, Sarah. It's really good to be here. I'm excited.
Absolutely. You have such a fascinating story, and we got to talk a couple months ago, and I just was thinking about it for just days and weeks after the fact. And I'm so excited for you to share a little bit about your story, how you decided to move to Honduras, and a little bit about how your ministry and organization developed.
Absolutely. Thanks. I grew up in Michigan and went to Calvin University, a Christian university right near my home, and met my husband there, Kurt. And when we were seniors, we were offered a job working with a Christian nonprofit organization in Costa Rica. And honestly, we had no idea even where Costa Rica was. We had to look it up on a map. But it seemed like a great adventure. It was a 2-year commitment, and that seemed perfect. And we thought we'd go to Costa Rica and then come back to the U.S. and start our real life, whatever that was going to be. And very quickly, we just fell in love with Central America, with the people, Spanish. We loved learning Spanish. We loved just all the beauty around us. And we stayed in Costa Rica for 2 years and then moved to Honduras and continued to work for the nonprofit for about 4 years in Honduras, and then went back to grad school and started our Justice Studies program in Honduras that we run for about 24 years now, I think. And at the same time, we started the organization that you mentioned, the Association for a More Just Society in Honduras. And really that came out of our Justice Studies semester program. We would get just the most amazing college students to come and study with us. They were curious, committed Christians who really wanted to understand what they were supposed to be doing in this big world. And they kept asking us, we would talk about a lot of issues in our classes. And, we could point to all kinds of programs that were trying to work on health issues, agriculture, poverty, but they kept saying, why aren't there any organizations that are working on the justice issues that we talk about corruption and violence and governments that don't work? And it was kind of a call to us through our students, God working clearly to guide us. And so we, with some Honduran friends, started AJS in 1998. And our goal was really just to be faithful to God's call to do justice. And we wanted to do that, especially, you mentioned that our part of our motto is that, or our mission is that we want to be brave Christians, because we realize that when you try and work on big issues, justice issues, there's a lot of pushback from the people who are holding on to the power. And so we wanted to be brave Christians, and we wanted to really focus on the most vulnerable people, because they are so often left out of these equations when people are trying to help. So we started this organization with no money, just with some friends. We started in a garage with a half-time staff person that we were just paying out of our pockets. And God has just been incredibly faithful and blessed the work that we're doing in ways that we never imagined. We have about 80 staff now, and we are still focusing on trying to figure out how to help the most vulnerable people. And that has meant working on what's causing violence in Honduras, what's causing corruption in Honduras. How can we help the Honduran government to be more responsive to its most vulnerable people, and strengthening its institutions so that kids have decent schools to go to, and poor people have hospitals that work that they can go to. So it has been so far an amazing life, and not something really that we ever expected.
Well, it's so helpful, I think, for our community to hear a little bit of what's happening in Honduras, because we hear that country's name kind of tossed around, or we hear it in headlines. We talked particularly in this community several years ago about the phrase Northern Triangle, because that was coming up in the news a lot, which refers to three Central American countries, Honduras being one of them. And there just always seems to be, when we're having conversations about the border, about immigration, that Honduras comes up. And so when we're talking about men, women, and children coming from Central America, and Honduras specifically, it's helpful to hear from somebody who lives there. If you can give us a little insight and to help us understand, why are people leaving? What are the push factors? And also we call them push and pull factors. What's pushing them from Honduras, and what's pulling them toward the United States?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it makes us sad that pretty much every time Honduras is in the news, it's for something negative, because we have found it to be just an amazing place with amazing people who have taught us so much. But I understand the realities as well. It's a difficult place to live right now. And as you mentioned, the what's often in the news is the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And there are a lot of push factors. Each of those three countries, they're neighboring countries, but they're also very distinct from each other. So they don't always have, the same issues. But there are some issues that are common to those three countries. And I can talk a bit about those, about what's pushing people out of Honduras. One of the things definitely that is pushing people out of Honduras is poverty. Kurt and I live in, and have lived for about 20 years, in the same very poor neighborhood outside of Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras. Mm-hmm. And I mean, my friends, about 60% of Hondurans are living on less than $2 a day. So if you think about what that would mean, cost of living isn't that much cheaper here. So it's basically just enough to maybe put food on the table for you and your family, but not much beyond that. In my neighborhood, lots of my friends get up at 3 a.m. to make tortillas, which is an incredibly long process, involving boiling corn and grinding corn and, making the tortillas and cooking them, and then going out to sell them. And they'll make maybe $5 in the day for their whole family. A lot of the men in my neighborhood are working as security guards. They're getting paid about 90 cents an hour, maybe. So it's very difficult. The poverty in Honduras and in those other two countries as well is a poverty that, I used to have people say to me, but if people just worked harder, if they actually, really wanted to work, they could make a living. I'm like, everybody in my neighborhood works harder than I do. They work longer hours, they're working physically demanding jobs, and it's still just really difficult. And then on top of that, Honduras for the COVID pandemic, the quarantine has been incredibly hard on poor people. I just actually was talking to someone who was telling me about a man who was a security guard in his neighborhood, and they didn't fire him, but they decided during the pandemic that they couldn't really pay him. So they've been paying him about $20 a month that he is trying to use to keep him and his wife alive. And then Honduras had 2 hurricanes, Category 5 hurricanes in November that just devastated the northern part of the country. And that's actually where I am right now, kind of doing some follow-up on how people are doing after the hurricane. So it's just, one thing after another. And that kind of poverty makes people want to go elsewhere. Another thing, and I'll be a little faster after poverty, but violence in Honduras is an issue for sure. And I want to point out, because I love this country, that the vast majority of people have absolutely nothing to do with the violence. It's a really tiny, tiny percentage that make life so difficult for the rest. And it's drug trafficking, because the cocaine from South America goes to the United States. A very large portion of the cocaine produced is going to consumers in the United States, and it's going through countries like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. And along with that comes all kinds of violence. And there are gangs who make life really difficult. And again, someone I was just talking to a few minutes ago told me that they know a young boy who joined the caravans going to the United States last month because he was being so heavily pressured by a gang to join, and he absolutely did not want to join that gang. So he joined the caravan, came back, and now our organization is trying to help relocate him to a safer place with his mom, but it's incredibly disruptive. So yeah, violence, poverty, and then corruption is also an issue. When drug traffickers come in, they tend to put people in their pockets, pay them off, bribe them. And when that happens, those authorities are now doing what the drug traffickers want, and they aren't doing the jobs that they should be. So things tend to fall by the wayside. The people who are supposed to be making sure the schools run are not doing so. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I think one of the big push factors that I see when I talk to people about why they're going, honestly, is out of this incredible love that they have for their family members. My friend Mireya went and immigrated because she saw that her mom was trying so hard to keep the rest of her family in school, her brothers and sisters, and just couldn't do it. And she wanted something better for her brothers and sisters. My friend David went to the States for 3 years because he so wanted to be able to have a welding business in Honduras, but there was just no way he was ever going to get the equipment he needed. He knew how to weld, but he didn't have the equipment. He went for 3 years to the States and came back, and now lives, a block away from me with his beautiful family. So I think we have to remember in this equation that it's people, for the most part, pretty much everybody I know that is going because they want to sacrifice for somebody else. They want to make life better for somebody that they love, parents or children or siblings. So yeah, those are some of the things that push people out of Honduras.
Well, I think you've captured so beautifully the tension of, there's the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, where this Nigerian author talks about, it's not that necessarily that stereotypes aren't true, but it's that they're not the full story. And I'm reminded, we took a women welcome trip a few years ago, and we were in Tijuana at a migrant shelter, and there was a Honduran man there that spoke to our group about his journey. And he immediately said, "Oh, Honduras is beautiful. I'll take you. If you ever want to go, I'll meet you there." And there was just this pull and this tension within him of, I need to go to this other place for many of these reasons that you've mentioned, but also I love my country and I love the people that I'm doing this on behalf of.
Yeah, and there's a very popular Facebook group that's titled Beauty in Honduras. And it's Hondurans pushing back against this narrative that our country is awful. It's, you know, whatever word you want to call it, there's nothing good happening, which is not true. And so they're constantly posting either nature shots or things that people are doing. And honestly, it is very demoralizing for Hondurans themselves to read about themselves in that single narrative that you mentioned. And it's so far from accurate. You know, it's got real pieces that are true, but then it misses the other part. So.
And that there are real people caught in that tension. And again, one time we met with this agency in Mexico, and one of the things they said about their countrymen who immigrate to the United States, they said everyone thinks it will be temporary, which, you know, I'd be curious to know if that is what you've experienced among your neighbors, but also what you see when people come back to Honduras after having spent time in the United States, whether they were deported or whether they came back on their own or whether they never made it. What do you witness in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, it varies a lot. What is true, both in the going and the returning, is that that kind of immigration is really hard on families. It's hard on families when someone goes. It's much better now. When we moved here, people in my neighborhood didn't even have phones. So it was very hard to keep in touch with these people that you really loved. Now, you know, everybody's video conferencing with their family members, which has been great for family unity.
What's that? But the world.
Yeah, but you know, a lot of the people who are being deported have also lived in the U.S. for quite a long time, and many times they're being deported without their loved ones. So for sure, an issue in kind of the returning can be that families are separated, or they may be reunited sometime. But honestly, there is very little support for those who are returned. Basically, you know, a lot of times they've invested a lot in the journey, and that can be really heartbreaking. People usually pay a lot of money to go to the United States in a way that is not too terribly risky. So they're paying coyotes, they call them, but men, you know, who know how to do it, those who are migrating irregularly, right? And then, you know, they often don't make it and are returned. And I was recently up in the mountains of Honduras, where Honduras grows a lot of coffee. Some of you may drink Honduran coffee, it's delicious. But the price of coffee has been incredibly low and has been really, really hard on coffee farmers. So this particular area of Honduras was almost all coffee farmers. And a number of them had tried to go to the US because they were just desperate. They couldn't get any money for their coffee. They couldn't even hire people to pick the coffee like they normally do, which is a really intensive process. So I was talking to these families who, some of them had sold their homes. They'd sold, you know, if they had an old pickup truck, they sold that. One family with just these three beautiful small children, were going to be kicked out of their house a couple days later because they had, you know, told somebody that they could have it. That person had paid them. They gave that money to the person who was going to take them to the border. And part of me thinks, well, that's the risk you took. You decided to go without papers, but also really understanding from living here the desperation that people feel. And, you know, the truth is that for Hondurans who are poor, there is really no legal way to go to the United States. There is not a work visa that they can apply for and go. And usually they can find jobs if they do go. So, and that does not excuse it at all. I have never ever helped anyone go to the United States, but I understand the desperation and the desire for something better.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm glad you said that, because I think for me, until I got involved in this conversation, I had no idea that there was no legal way for someone in Honduras who happened to be poor to be able to come and work in the United States. I assumed that there was a way and that they were choosing not to take it. And so therefore that led to questions, right? And it wasn't until I got in this conversation that I learned, oh, that's not an option. And so, when we talk about getting into line, for many people, there is not a line for them to get into. And so from these sort of structural perspectives, which you guys are so great at addressing, we know on the immigration side, there's a question of how do we create access to legal immigration and what impact would that have on irregular immigration? And so, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think at least for me, that was completely new information several years ago.
Yeah, and that's obviously a really complex issue. And, absolutely, the U.S. needs to secure its own borders and make sure that the people who are coming are people that we want, that are going to contribute to our society, to our economy, which I can tell you that most of the Hondurans that I know, they would be absolutely thrilled to contribute to the U.S. economy. So it's a really complex issue, but it's also the reason that people do go undocumented, because that path doesn't exist right now. And I am not an expert at all on immigration reform, but I can just tell you from my perspective, everybody I know would much prefer to be able to get in line and get a visa if they could, because it's a scary, dangerous journey and very risky, whether or not you'll make it. So
I can only imagine some of the stories you've heard from people who've come back. And I'm curious if you've heard from anyone who's been held in U.S. detention, or kind of what their experience was like in the United States. Did they receive the kind of welcome that they expected? What have you witnessed in people's experiences there?
Yeah, that is a good question. And honestly, it's not something that people like to talk about a lot. It's scary for people, right? It can be a long process, and it's just not an ideal situation when there are too many people and it's taxing U.S. services, which I completely understand. But it's just a time of a lot of uncertainty and I think just sadness for people to know that, like the boy who was trying to get away from the gangs, and that whole caravan was returned to Honduras, which is understandable. It was a lot of people, but each individual in that caravan who was going for a specific reason, it's hard and it's depressing, and it's it just makes people feel uncertain about what do I do next? What's my future going to be? So.
We have a question in the public comments that I just want to address, because there was some confusion if we were saying there's no way for any Hondurans to immigrate legally. And so I just want to clarify that there are some pathways. Poverty in and of itself is not a pathway that's available, and Women of Welcome has some other resources we can share with that. But there's also been different legislations in past decades and experiences that have opened doors for different people at different times. So I just wanted to clarify that we're not saying there is no way for Hondurans to ever immigrate legally, because that would be inaccurate. So I just wanted to clarify that real quickly.
No, absolutely. There are many, many Hondurans living legally in the U.S. With permanent visas. Lots more who can go as tourists, etc. But if you are poor and have few resources, it's very unlikely that you will get a visa to go work in the United States.
I want to ask a question that we actually hear a lot in our Women of Welcome community, and addresses some of the things that you were talking about earlier around corruption and poverty and violence and some of these different things. And so a question that people will often ask us is, well, if, I'm empathetic or I'm sympathetic maybe that things are hard in Honduras, but why don't people stay and address those problems? What would you say to that? Because you all are so invested in addressing those problems, but I think that's a question people have, is why are we talking about immigration for these reasons? Why can't people stay and address those challenges?
Yeah, that is a great question. And my really short answer would be, most people do. Most people do stay in Honduras, population of about 10 million people. And we work with many of these people who are just amazing in the way that they look for solutions in their communities. And our organization has had the privilege of, I said we have 80 staff people. We also have thousands of volunteers around the country who are working in the local schools, making sure that teachers show up. One of the things that we did a few years ago was the public schools of Honduras were just a disaster. And kids were getting about 80 days of school a month. A year, sorry, 80 days of school a year. And they were supposed to get 200. And there were complicated reasons for why that was happening. But we just decided in our organization, let's just do a campaign called 200 Days of School and just start pushing for 200 days of school. And all of these parents who were poor parents, because if your kids are in the public school in Honduras, you're probably fairly poor because they're so bad. They were like, we'll help, what can we do? So we set up this whole volunteer network of people who came alongside the teachers in the school, but also made sure they showed up every day. And I think it took about 2 or 3 years when we hit 200 days of school in Honduras. And up till now, the pandemic, Honduras was getting over 200 days. We also have programs that are really targeting violence in Honduras. Our Peace and Justice program works in the worst communities and tries to come alongside the police to apprehend those who are causing the violence in that community. And pretty much every community that we move into with this program, the Peace and Justice program, violence has gone down significantly. And it's because people trust that they can say, I know who did that. I know you people, and I trust you, so I'm going to tell you what happened. And it allows the police to actually do their jobs. And we have all kinds of people in the communities who are participating in that. Impact clubs for at-risk youth, where there's all kinds of people in the community who work as mentors. So lots of people do stay. And those that go, for the reasons that I mentioned, it's very hard to change things on your own, right? You need to be part of a bigger group. And even then, it's a long-term solution. And for some people, if you're fleeing from violence, if your family doesn't have any food, you may feel that I just can't stay and wait for this to change. But most people do. Most people do stay, and a lot of people try to be part of change for good.
That's such a good reminder, because I do think if you're only in the US, you're only seeing the people who are coming. And so it's helpful to remember this is still a small percentage of all of the people who live in this country who are actively working and trying to participate in their civic responsibilities and communities. And so that's a helpful reminder.
Yeah, and a lot of those people are sending a tremendous amount of money back to their families in Honduras and trying to help that way. Those who do go to the U.S. and work in the U.S., it's a crazy high number of the amount of their paychecks that they're trying to invest back with their families in Honduras, which is pretty cool too.
Yeah, it's a tremendous level of sacrifice. You mentioned that earlier, of just that sacrifice element, and sacrificial element. I think it's helpful to be reminded of that framing and just understanding the choices that people are making and some of the reasons that they're motivated to do that. Again, I just want to Honduras feels very far away for many of us in the United States. Even my husband is from Guatemala, and everyone's surprised when we always say it's a 2.5-hour flight. It's not as far away as you think, but it feels very far away. And the problems that you're describing feel very distant from me personally as an individual woman in Georgia. And we're watching headlines about the border. Can you help us connect the dots of why it's important for us to both understand what's happening in Honduras, but also wanting to engage in some way when we feel so small and far away? Yeah. I mean, it is very easy to feel like it's so far away, right? We laugh sometimes with family too, because California is
farther from my home in Michigan than Honduras is. It's a farther journey. But yeah, I mean, Central America is literally on the doorstep of the US, Mexico and Central America. And historically, it's a fascinating history, but historically, Central America and the US have been incredibly intertwined. Politically, economically, Honduras makes lots of the clothes that probably if some of you right now check the tags of your shirt, you'll see made in Honduras. And that's a huge part of Honduras' economy, is making clothes for US consumers. So the health of both countries is interlinked as well. And the problems of Honduras, unfortunately, and Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, these problems spill over into the US. And so I just really believe personally that it would be nice if we could just ignore what's happening. But number one, it's not what God asked us to do. Pretty clearly, He asked us to reach out to our neighbors. But also, our countries are so connected that the problems of Central America become the problems of the US as well. So I think, I still believe there is a lot of hope in Honduras and lots of things we could do to invest in these things that are pushing people out of the country. And, for sure, one of them is to figure out how can we deal with what's going on at the border, because that's not good for anybody, the way that things are going down right now. And as I said, I'm not an expert on that issue, but also there's so many things that we can do as citizens of the United States to help the countries of the Northern Triangle, countries like Honduras. So yeah, I just feel like it's our calling as Christians, and it's also just the smart thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really helpful because, I know we've been having some conversations in our Women of Welcome private group because, we're watching right now as asylum seekers are at the border, and the administration is trying to figure out ways to address kind of the surge of folks approaching the border and claiming asylum and all of these different things. And there's a question of how do we recognize that we want to both, from my perspective, it's a both and. We want to be welcoming people, and we also want to recognize that there are ways to create more opportunity and choice for people in their home countries. And so how can we support Honduran individuals and families in their home country so that they can feel like they have more opportunity and choices, so that they don't feel like, well, I have to, if I want to start a welding business, I have to go to the United States to do that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are things that we can do at different levels, right? So I am guessing that a lot of our listeners are already doing things. They're supporting work in other countries. And I would just encourage you, when you're looking for things to support, look for programs, look for projects that are really trying to fight against these things that are pushing people out of their countries. So poverty is one of the big issues. So there are good income generation projects, programs that try and come alongside people who are poor and help them to create a business, or give them whatever the piece is that they don't have so that they can't move forward with their business. Also, I mentioned some of the anti-violence programs, mentoring programs for youth, programs that try and protect at-risk kids so that they don't end up having to get involved in gangs, scholarships so kids can stay in school, leadership programs so that we have more of these people who want to stay and know how they can contribute. So kind of at the community level, I think that's a fantastic way of getting involved. At the country level, I think there are also lots of advocacy groups within these countries, groups who are trying to hold government accountable, like ours, but there are many others as well, who are trying to figure out how to strengthen government institutions. And a lot of times, those kind of programs, your money can go a long way. You know, you can support a small staff who has figured out what do we need to do to hold accountable government officials so that they don't get away with corruption or they don't ignore their responsibilities to the most vulnerable people. So yeah, at the country level, look for groups that are doing that. And in the US, and I have to like really convict myself to do this because it can get very overwhelming or frustrating, but I think we need to pay attention to what the US government is doing because it does impact these countries and it does impact all of us as a whole, as a community of Americans, North Americans, Central Americans, South Americans, we're kind of all interrelated. So pay attention to what's happening, what people are voting on, and I know that this could be incredibly complicated and divisive, but try and learn for yourself. What are the things that I think will help? What are the things that I can get behind? And, you know, do what you can to support those kind of policies. And I think that can have a big impact on the future of these countries.
I think it's really helpful to be reminded that there's all these different on-ramps because I think it can be a default response sometimes when we see different headlines to think, well, other people should just be doing this, that, or the other, you know, and we kind of can assume that we have ideas of what people would be doing. But I think that it's a good reminder that if this is something we are exploring and as we learn more about it, that there's some responsibility that we can lean into. One thing that stood out to me very early as you were talking was about coffee. And you know that when the prices of coffee are low in the United States, that has a direct impact on people's quality of life in Honduras. And so as an individual woman in Georgia, how can I think about where do I source my coffee from? Because I am committed to my coffee.
Exactly. Well, source it from Honduras and you'll get delicious coffee and help some poor farmers. Yeah.
Yes, I think there's all these small ways that we can participate in moving our communities forward together. And I think you've named some really great things, from paying attention to policies in the US that impact Honduras, thinking about the organizations we support there, even down to kind of our micro choices about clothing and coffee and all those things. But I will admit, it all still feels like just a drop into the ocean of the bigness of this challenge. Do you have any words of encouragement for our community to try to take those first steps into thinking? Because this is a really, it's a shift from just thinking about our borders to thinking about these kind of global dynamics.
Yeah, it is. It takes a lot of bandwidth in our brain, right? I guess what I would say is that as somebody who's lived in Honduras for the past 30 years, I have seen change happen. I think that sometimes we just think things have always been like this and they're going to stay like this, and you know, there's nothing we can do, and that has not been our experience. Just very quickly, something that we accomplished in Honduras a couple of years ago that I don't think any of us ever thought could happen was a purge of the Honduran police. And our organization kept pushing because there was a lot of corruption in the police for a purge. And it had been tried before and it didn't happen, but some of our staff got named to this purge commission. And in the end, over half of the Honduran police were removed from their positions and new, much better trained, younger police came in to take their place, and the number of police was also increased. And it was something that we were so excited about because we knew it was key to bringing down, and the violence level in Honduras has dropped dramatically since then. From a high in 2012, Honduras had about the highest homicide rate in the world, and now it has dropped considerably to about a third of what it was. And so I think, you know, just that is an example that change is possible, that the things that we support can make a difference. And yeah, I mean, I think we don't have a choice but to stay engaged. God tells us that we need to care for those who are most vulnerable. And I think those who are most vulnerable are loved by God, whether they are on Honduran soil or they are on US soil. They are the same people made in God's image that God calls us to love and to welcome. So yeah, wherever you find these people, I think our response is to love and to care for our neighbor.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And this has been such a great conversation because we are so often, because we are a community predominantly of US women talking about immigration and refugee issues in the United States, it's really helpful, I think, to sort of step outside some of that and hear from someone who's living in a different country, in a country that is sending a lot of immigrants. And so hearing what's happening there, both the challenges and the good things that are happening, it's encouraging to know that there is work happening all around and that we can just be a little more aware to some of the complexities of all of these issues. Every time I I ask a question, I have another question. It just goes a little bit deeper into the nuance and all of the different factors that are influencing people's lives. And so I want to end with a question we always ask all of our guests, which is, what is Christ-like welcome to you?
I love that question. And I love the idea of a Christ-like welcome. And I mentioned towards the beginning of our chat that I think a lot of Hondurans leave because of love, because they love their family and they want to try and figure out how to give them a better future. And I think that has to be the basis of our Christ-like welcome as well. And I love the story in Luke 10, just before Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which is all about how to care for our neighbors. He tells that story because he was approached by a teacher of the law who asked him what he needed to do to inherit eternal life. And Jesus, of course, turns the question back on him and says, "What do you think?" And he says, "To love God and to love my neighbor." And Jesus said, "That's it. That's exactly it. Those two things." And I love that story because it puts loving God and loving our neighbor as on the same plane as two sides of a coin. And then if I really do want to love God, I have to figure out how to love my neighbor, even when it's hard, even when my neighbor is doing things that I don't think they should be doing. How do I still love that person and try and fix that situation? So yeah, I think Christ-like welcome is loving God and loving our neighbor in a way that is real, tangible.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us your story and your experience and the ways that you're engaging in your community. It's just been so joyful to hear from you and to learn from your work and experience. And I want to thank everybody who was able to join us live, or if you're watching the replay, thank you for watching. Remember, you can always connect with Women of Welcome on Facebook, including our private group, or on Instagram at Women of Welcome. We are so glad you're here, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Bye, Jo Ann.
Bye. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.